This seat isn't for people like you. Security, remove this man immediately. Rachel Morrison's voice cut through the first-class cabin like a blade loud enough for every passenger to freeze mid-conversation. She pointed directly at the black man in the gray hoodie, her finger trembling with righteous authority. Her face flushed with the kind of confidence that comes from believing you're absolutely right. What she didn't know was that in exactly 8 minutes, Marcus Williams would fire her ground the entire fleet and shut down Skyline Airways indefinitely. Before we dive into this story, tell me where you're watching from. Comment your city below. And if this moment stopped you in your tracks, hit that subscribe button because what happens next will leave you speechless. The first-class cabin of Skyline Airways Flight 892 gleamed under warm golden lighting, every surface polished to perfection. Crystal wine glasses caught the light like tiny stars. Leather seats the color of rich cream stretched in perfect rows, each one wide enough to be a small throne. The air carried hints of lavender and vanilla, carefully designed to make passengers feel they had stepped into a world where money could buy peace, comfort, and respect. But peace was about to shatter. Chicago O'Hare International Airport buzzed with its usual Tuesday afternoon energy. Gate C-12 hummed with the quiet conversations of business travelers, their voices mixing with the distant rumble of jet engines, and the occasional announcement echoing through the terminal. Outside the massive windows, silver aircraft lined up like sleeping giants waiting for their turn to carry dreams across oceans. Inside the first-class lounge, passengers had been settling into their seats for the past 20 minutes. The 2:47 p.m. departure to Tokyo represented different things to different people. For some, it was just another business trip. For others, it was the flight that would change everything. Sofia Hernandez adjusted her phone in seat 3B, checking the angle for her travel blog content. At 28, she had built a following of 250,000 Instagram followers by documenting her adventures around the world, but more importantly by calling out injustice when she saw it. Her phone was always ready, her finger always hovering over the record button. Today, something in the cabin's atmosphere felt wrong. James Mitchell, seated in 2C, scrolled through his tablet, reviewing notes for the tech conference awaiting him in Tokyo. As a venture capitalist who had seen fortunes made and lost in boardrooms across Silicon Valley, he had learned to read the temperature of any room within seconds. His live streaming channel had gained traction by giving insider perspectives on the business world, and his audience trusted him to tell the truth, even when it was uncomfortable. Dr. Patricia Hayes settled into seat 2A with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had earned her place through decades of hard work. As a cardiovascular surgeon, she was accustomed to being one of the few women in exclusive spaces, but that experience hadn't necessarily made her more sensitive to others facing similar challenges. She glanced around the cabin with the casual assessment of someone who belonged. Maria Rodriguez stood at the jetway entrance, passenger manifest in hand, watching the final boarding process with growing unease. At 31, she had worked as a gate agent for Skyline Airways for 6 years, and she had seen patterns that made her stomach turn. She knew the passenger list by heart, knew exactly who belonged in every seat, but she also knew that speaking up could cost her everything. The corporate lawyer in seat 4A, David Patterson, had boarded early and immediately begun reviewing contracts on his laptop. His legal mind was always working, always cataloging details that others might miss. He had built his practice on cases where corporations thought they could hide behind policies and procedures, and his recording device was never far from reach. And then Marcus Williams walked through the cabin door. He moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had learned that power didn't need to announce itself with expensive clothes or flashy jewelry. His navy blue hoodie was soft from countless washes, his dark jeans fitted but unremarkable, his sneakers showing the kind of wear that came from actually walking places instead of riding in limousines. The backpack over his shoulder looked like something a college student might carry, not a billionaire heading to close a $300 million deal. But it was his eyes that told the real story. They held the calm of someone who had faced judgment his entire life and learned to navigate it without losing his dignity. At 38, Marcus Williams had built Vanguard Technologies from a dorm room idea into one of the most influential artificial intelligence companies in the world. His net worth exceeded $2.8 billion, and through carefully structured investments, he owned 42% of Skyline Airways. None of that showed in his appearance as he walked down the aisle, boarding pass in hand, looking for seat 1A. The reaction was immediate. Rachel Morrison stood near the galley polishing wine glasses with mechanical precision, but her movement stopped the moment she saw him. At 34, she had worked for Skyline Airways for 8 years, long enough to develop what she considered a professional eye for passengers who fit in first class. She had completed bias training 3 times, signed documents acknowledging company policies on discrimination, and attended seminars on inclusive customer service. None of that mattered when her unconscious beliefs kicked in. She watched Marcus approach his seat, her jaw tightening with each step he took. In her mind, first-class passengers looked a certain way, dressed a certain way, carried themselves with the unmistakable polish of old money or new success. This man looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong section, maybe someone who had found a discarded boarding pass or was trying to scam his way into a better seat. Marcus reached row 1 and paused, checking his boarding pass against the illuminated seat number. 1A. First-class window seat. The seat he had specifically requested for the extra privacy it provided during important phone calls. He slipped off his backpack and began to stow it in the overhead compartment. "Excuse me, sir." Rachel's voice carried the artificial sweetness of customer service training layered over genuine suspicion. "Are you sure you're in the right cabin?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Other passengers looked up from their phones and tablets. Sofia Hernandez's thumb moved instinctively toward her camera app. James Mitchell glanced over the top of his tablet, his live streamer's instincts sensing content. Marcus finished stowing his bag and turned to face Rachel with the patience of someone who had answered this question before. "Yes, I'm sure. Seat 1A. He held up his boarding pass, the Platinum Elite status clearly visible. Rachel squinted at the pass as if trying to decode a foreign language. She took it from his hand, studying it with exaggerated care, turning it over, holding it up to the light. Her examination took long enough for the entire cabin to notice. "This is interesting," she murmured loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "Mr. Williams, is it? And you purchased this ticket yourself?" The question landed like a slap. Sofia Hernandez sat up straighter, her phone now openly recording. James Mitchell minimized his work and opened his live streaming app. "Doctor." Hayes looked over with growing discomfort, recognizing the tone, if not yet the full implications. Marcus's expression didn't change. His voice remained level-controlled. "Yes, I purchased it myself." "Is there a problem?" "Well," Rachel continued, her confidence growing with each word. "It's just that we've been having issues with fraudulent bookings lately. People finding discarded boarding passes using stolen credit cards, that sort of thing. You understand, I'm sure. We have to be careful." The cabin temperature seemed to drop. Conversation stopped. The gentle hum of the air conditioning became the loudest sound in the space. Marcus sat down in 1A and fastened his seatbelt. "I understand you have procedures. I'm happy to provide additional identification if needed." But Rachel wasn't satisfied. She pressed the call button on her service panel, sending a discreet signal to the cockpit. "Captain Sullivan, we may have a situation in first class. Suspicious passenger, possibly fraudulent documentation." The words carried clearly through the cabin. Sofia Hernandez made sure her phone was capturing audio. James Mitchell had gone live, his viewer count climbing rapidly as word spread through tech Twitter that something was happening on a flight. "I'm filming this," Sofia announced, clearly not hiding her camera. "This treatment is unacceptable." Rachel spun toward her. "Ma'am, please put your phone away. This is a private conversation." Nothing's private when you're discriminating against a paying passenger, Sophia shot back. This is being posted. People need to see this. James Mitchell leaned forward, addressing his live stream audience. We're witnessing something disturbing on Skyline Airways Flight 892. A black passenger in first class is being questioned about the legitimacy of his ticket despite providing all required documentation. Dr. Hayes, who had been silent up to this point, spoke quietly to her seatmate. I've seen this before. This isn't about procedures. The seeds of viral content were already sprouting. Sophia's Instagram story was being shared by followers who recognized the signs of racial profiling. James's tech audience was reposting clips across Twitter and LinkedIn. David Patterson, the corporate lawyer, had discreetly activated his voice recorder and was taking detailed notes. And from the jetway, Maria Rodriguez watched with growing alarm. She knew Marcus Williams' name was on the manifest. She knew his ticket was legitimate, his status was real, his seat assignment was correct. But she also knew that speaking up could end her career. The tension in the cabin thickened like storm clouds gathering before lightning strikes. Captain Derek Sullivan's voice crackled over the intercom, professional but clearly annoyed. Ms. Morrison, what's the nature of the delay? We're already behind schedule. Rachel leaned closer to her communication device, speaking quietly but not quietly enough. Passenger in 1A appears to be using fraudulent documentation. May need removal before departure. Marcus Williams remained seated, his outward calm masking a lifetime of experiences that had taught him to expect exactly this moment. At 38, he had built one of the most valuable technology companies in the world, but success hadn't insulated him from the assumptions people made based on the color of his skin. The first time it happened, he was 16 years old. Marcus had spent months preparing for the national debate tournament in Atlanta. His high school in Detroit had scraped together funds to send him their star student to compete against the country's elite prep schools. He had worn his father's best suit, carried a briefcase his mother had saved for months to buy, and walked into the host hotel with the confidence of someone who belonged. The man behind the registration desk had looked him up and down with the same expression Rachel Morrison wore now. Son, I think you're in the wrong place. The community center is about 6 blocks east. Marcus had shown his registration paperwork, his school identification, even the letter from his debate coach. None of it mattered. Systems down, the clerk had said with a shrug. You'll have to come back when the manager's here tomorrow. Marcus had slept in the hotel parking lot that night, using his debate prep materials as a pillow. The next morning, he had walked back into that lobby and demanded to speak to the manager. This time, with a different clerk on duty, his reservation appeared in the computer immediately, but the damage was done. Marcus had learned that being excellent wasn't enough. Being prepared wasn't enough. Having every right to be somewhere didn't matter if the person with power decided you didn't belong. That night, sleeping on hotel sheets he had rightfully paid for, Marcus had made a decision. Someday, he would have enough power that no one could make him sleep in a parking lot again. More importantly, he would use that power to make sure others didn't have to endure what he had experienced. The path from that hotel parking lot to the CEO suite of Vanguard Technologies had been built on that promise. Marcus's parents had given him the foundation for everything that followed. His mother, Dr. Evelyn Williams, taught 8th grade mathematics at an inner-city school, where budget cuts meant buying supplies with her own money and fighting for her students' futures one test score at a time. She had shown Marcus that true strength was quiet strength, that dignity was something no one could take from you, only something you could surrender. His father, Robert Williams, had worked as an automotive technician for 37 years, coming home each night with grease under his fingernails and stories about fixing problems that others thought were impossible. He had taught Marcus that every system had logic, that understanding how something worked was the first step to making it work better, and that persistence was more valuable than talent. Son, his father had said during Marcus's senior year of high school, the world's going to try to tell you who you are and where you belong. Your job is to listen to your own voice louder than theirs. MIT had offered Marcus a full scholarship based on his artificial intelligence research proposal. His freshman roommate, a legacy student from Connecticut, had spent their first week together asking if Marcus was there on a sports scholarship, assuming that a black kid from Detroit couldn't possibly belong in one of the world's most prestigious engineering programs for academic reasons. Marcus had responded by graduating summa cum laude in 3 years. His first startup, developed in his dorm room, had revolutionized data compression algorithms. When venture capitalists dismissed his ideas during pitch meetings, asking if he had adult supervision for his company, Marcus had bootstrapped the development with freelance coding work and student loans. When the same VCs who had rejected him called 18 months later begging to invest, Marcus had politely declined and sold the company to Google for $50 million instead. The money had been nice. The respect had been better. But it was the 13th time he had been questioned about his presence in a first-class cabin that had prompted Marcus to research airline ownership structures. He had discovered that many airlines, including Skyline Airways, were publicly traded companies where large enough shareholdings could influence policy decisions. So Marcus had started buying. At first, it had been purely personal. If he owned part of the airline, maybe his boarding passes would be questioned less frequently. But as his ownership stake grew, so did his understanding of how widespread the problem really was. Flight attendants were trained to spot suspicious behavior, but their definition of suspicious seemed to correlate strongly with passenger demographics. Complaint records showed patterns that made Marcus's jaw clench with recognition. Rachel Morrison, for instance, had been involved in 3 previous incidents where minority passengers had been questioned about ticket legitimacy. Each time, human resources had classified the events as procedural thoroughness rather than discrimination. Each time, the passengers had been too intimidated or too isolated to pursue formal complaints. Marcus now owned 42% of Skyline Airways through a carefully structured network of shell companies and investment funds. The airline's board knew him as a major shareholder, but most employees, including Rachel Morrison, had no idea who actually signed their paychecks. Today, that anonymity was about to end. Rachel Morrison had grown up in Helena, Montana, population 32,000, where diversity meant knowing families who had lived there for 3 generations instead of 4. Her first job out of high school had been at the local airport checking tickets for a regional carrier that made 2 flights per day to Denver. She had been good at the work, efficient and thorough, and when Skyline Airways had recruited her for their training program, she had seen it as her chance to see the world. 8 years later, she had worked flights to 43 countries and prided herself on maintaining the highest standards of service. She genuinely believed she treated all passengers equally, that her careful attention to detail was protecting the airline and its guests from fraud and security risks. Rachel didn't see her own bias because it felt like professionalism. When she spent extra time examining boarding passes from passengers who didn't look like first-class travelers, she told herself she was being thorough. When she questioned the legitimacy of tickets from young people or casually dressed passengers, she convinced herself she was preventing theft. She had never confronted the fact that her definition of suspicious almost exclusively applied to people who didn't look like her. The bias training sessions Skyline Airways required had felt like politically correct box-checking to Rachel. She had sat through presentations about unconscious prejudice and inclusive customer service, but she had categorized them as corporate overreach rather than necessary education. In her mind, real discrimination was obvious and intentional. She would never use racial slurs or explicitly refuse service based on skin color, so she believed she was free from prejudice. But prejudice rarely announced itself with slurs. More often, it whispered through assumptions, through questions that weren't asked of everyone equally, through procedures that were applied selectively. Captain Derek Sullivan represented old-school aviation authority. At 52, he had been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years, accumulating enough flight hours to circle the Earth more than 200 times. He had started his career when aviation was even more homogeneous than today, and his mental image of passengers was formed by decades of serving a clientele that had, until recently, been overwhelmingly white and wealthy. Derek wasn't malicious, but he was comfortable. Comfortable with assumptions, comfortable with hierarchies, comfortable with a world where his judgment was rarely questioned. When Rachel Morrison called the cockpit about a suspicious passenger, Derek's response was automatic. Trust the crew, support the team, maintain schedule efficiency. The thought that Rachel might be wrong, that her suspicion might be unfounded, didn't immediately occur to him. In his experience, flight attendants who had worked for Skyline as long as Rachel didn't make frivolous calls about passenger problems. But Derek also didn't know that Rachel had made similar calls before, or that each time the passengers in question had turned out to be legitimate travelers whose only crime was failing to match Rachel's expectations. The corporate culture at Skyline Airways had created an environment where bias could flourish under the cover of procedure. Official policies prohibited discrimination, but unofficial norms allowed it to persist. Training sessions addressed explicit prejudice but ignored subtle microaggressions. Complaint procedures existed but were complex enough to discourage most passengers from pursuing them. Marcus Williams understood these dynamics because he had studied them, lived them, and decided to change them. His ownership stake in Skyline Airways wasn't just an investment strategy. It was a comprehensive approach to solving a problem that had followed him from Detroit to MIT to boardrooms across the world. The man sitting calmly in seat 1A, enduring Rachel Morrison's suspicions with practiced patience, was about to demonstrate what happened when someone with real power decided that enough was enough. Captain Sullivan emerged from the cockpit like a storm front moving across calm skies. At 6 feet tall with silver hair, and the kind of commanding presence that came from decades of being the final authority in emergency situations, he filled the narrow aisle of the first-class cabin with unquestioned power. His appearance sent a ripple through the already tense atmosphere. Passengers who had been discreetly watching the unfolding situation now openly stared. Sophia Hernandez adjusted her phone angle to capture the captain's approach. James Mitchell whispered to his live-stream audience, the pilots now involved. "This is escalating fast." Sir Captain Sullivan's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "I understand there's an issue with your documentation." Marcus looked up from his seat with the same calm expression he had maintained throughout Rachel's interrogation. "No issue at all, Captain. My documentation is in order. Ms. Morrison has expressed concerns about the legitimacy of your boarding pass." Sullivan continued his tone, suggesting that Rachel's concerns were equivalent to federal regulations. "In the interest of security and on-time departure, I'm going to need you to step off the aircraft while we verify your information." The words landed like a judge's gavel. Around the cabin, phones came out of pockets and purses. This wasn't subtle discrimination anymore. This was a public ejection. "Captain Sullivan," Marcus replied, his voice steady, but carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. "I would strongly recommend you verify my information before asking me to leave." Rachel Morrison stepped closer, emboldened by her captain's support. Sir passengers who can actually afford first-class tickets typically dress appropriately for the privilege. The sentence hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Sophia Hernandez gasped audibly. "Did you just say what I think you said?" Her phone captured Rachel's face as the words sank in the moment when casual bias became explicit prejudice. James Mitchell's live-stream viewer count was climbing rapidly as clips were shared across social media. "This is happening live on Skyline Airways," he narrated for his audience. "A black passenger is being ejected from first class based purely on his appearance." Dr. Patricia Hayes, who had been uncomfortable but silent up to this point, finally spoke. "Excuse me, this treatment is completely unacceptable. I'm a physician and I've traveled extensively. This man has done nothing wrong." Rachel spun toward Dr. Hayes with irritation. "Ma'am, we're following standard security procedures. Fraudulent ticket use is a federal crime. What evidence do you have of fraud? Dr. Hayes demanded. He showed you his boarding pass. He provided identification. What more do you need? David Patterson. The corporate lawyer looked up from his notes with the expression of someone who had just witnessed a textbook civil rights violation. Captain, I'm an attorney, and I'm documenting every word of this interaction. You should know that what's happening here is legally problematic. Captain Sullivan bristled at the implied challenge to his authority. Sir, I'm responsible for the safety and security of this aircraft. If my crew has concerns about a passenger, those concerns take precedence over opinions. Even when those concerns appear to be racially motivated, Patterson pressed. That's a serious accusation, Sullivan replied, but his voice carried less certainty than before. Marcus remained seated throughout this exchange, watching the drama unfold around him with the calm of someone who had anticipated every development. He pulled out his phone and sent a simple text. It's happening. Flight 892. 3 seconds later, his phone buzzed with a response. Everything's ready. Rachel Morrison's confidence was growing with each passing moment of support from Captain Sullivan. She had called for backup and received it. The questioning passengers were being managed. Soon this disruption would be resolved, and they could return to normal service. Sir, she said to Marcus, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who believed she was winning. We're going to need you to collect your belongings and exit the aircraft. Security is on their way to escort you. Marcus looked directly at her. Ms. Morrison, are you absolutely certain this is how you want to handle this situation? I'm following procedures, Rachel replied. Passengers who cannot provide legitimate documentation for premium seating are required to move to their appropriate section or leave the aircraft. And you've determined that my documentation is not legitimate based on what criteria? The question caught Rachel off guard. She had expected compliance argument or anger. She hadn't expected cross-examination. Based on standard verification procedures, she stammered, which include profiling passengers by their clothing choices, Marcus asked quietly. I don't profile anyone, Rachel shot back. I treat all passengers equally. Sofia Hernandez almost laughed at the obvious contradiction. Her Instagram story was being shared by dozens of followers, each share expanding the audience for what was rapidly becoming a viral moment of corporate discrimination. James Mitchell addressed his growing live stream audience. We're watching a masterclass in how not to handle customer service. This passenger is asking reasonable questions, and the crew is doubling down on their assumptions. The cabin had become a pressure cooker. Every passenger was now involved, either actively supporting Marcus or silently complying with the crew's authority. The artificial division between first class and the rest of the plane had dissolved into a single arena where justice and prejudice were fighting in real time. Captain Sullivan made the decision that would define his career. Security has been called. Sir, you have 2 minutes to collect your belongings and exit voluntarily, or you will be removed. On what grounds? David Patterson demanded, his legal instincts in full activation mode. Disruptive passenger behavior, Sullivan replied. What behavior has been disruptive? Dr. Hayes asked. Asking questions, requesting equal treatment, sitting quietly in his assigned seat. Passengers who refuse to comply with crew instructions, Rachel interjected. What instruction has he refused? Sophia called out, her phone capturing every word. You've asked him to leave based on his appearance. That's not an instruction, that's discrimination. The hashtags were already spreading, Skyline shame racist, airline boycott Skyline. The story was appearing on Twitter faster than Skyline's PR team could monitor it. News outlets that tracked viral content were beginning to pick up the thread. Marcus Williams stood slowly. For a moment, Rachel Morrison felt the satisfaction of victory. The disruptive passenger was finally complying with instructions. But Marcus didn't move toward the exit. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Victoria, he said, clearly placing the call on speaker so the entire cabin could hear. It's me. I'm on flight 892. You need to see the live streams. The phone rang once before a crisp, professional voice answered. Marcus, what's happening? Every conversation in the cabin stopped. The name Marcus had just used the familiarity in his voice, the immediate response from whoever Victoria was. These details registered in dozens of minds simultaneously. Rachel Morrison's confident expression began to crack. Captain Sullivan's authoritative posture wavered slightly. Something in the air had shifted like the moment before lightning strikes. Victoria. I'm being asked to leave my assigned first-class seat because your crew believes my boarding pass is fraudulent. Marcus continued, his voice carrying a tone of professional disappointment that sent chills down Rachel's spine. That's impossible, the voice on the phone replied. Your ticket was purchased through our Executive Services Division. Captain Sullivan. Are you there? Captain Sullivan's face had gone pale. This is Captain Sullivan. Who am I speaking with? This is Victoria Palmer, CEO of Skyline Airways. Captain, you're speaking to Marcus Williams, CEO of Vanguard Technologies and our largest private shareholder. The words hit the cabin like a physical force. Rachel Morrison actually stumbled backward. James Mitchell whispered to his live stream, Holy shit. Did she just say what I think she said? Sofia Hernandez's eyes widened as she continued filming. The man who had been calmly enduring discrimination for the past 15 minutes wasn't just another passenger. He was the owner of the airline. Dr. Hayes covered her mouth in shock. David Patterson stopped taking notes and stared. Even passengers from economy class drawn by the commotion stood in the aisle with expressions of disbelief. Marcus Williams continued speaking with the same calm authority he had maintained throughout the ordeal. Victoria, I want to review the complaint history for crew members involved in this incident. I also want to understand how bias training has been implemented and monitored. Immediately, Sir Victoria Palmer's voice carried the crisp efficiency of someone who understood that a major crisis was unfolding in real time. Captain Sullivan, Ms. Morrison, you're both suspended from duty, effective immediately. Mr. Williams, I'm sending our regional manager to your location. Rachel Morrison's world collapsed in that instant. The confident, professional flight attendant who had been protecting her airline from fraudulent passengers was now facing the reality that she had just humiliated her company's owner based on nothing more than the color of his skin and the casualness of his clothes. Mr. Williams, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the air conditioning. I didn't know. Marcus turned to face her directly. Miss Morrison, you didn't know because you didn't ask. You saw my appearance and made assumptions. Those assumptions led you to question my legitimacy, my honesty, and my right to sit in a seat I purchased. Captain Sullivan stepped forward, his authority now completely undermined. Sir, I was following standard procedures. Captain Marcus replied, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from boardrooms rather than cockpits. There is no standard procedure for removing passengers based on their clothing choices. There is no protocol for questioning ticket legitimacy without evidence. What happened here was bias, pure and simple. The social media explosion was immediate and massive. Sophia's Instagram live viewer count hit 50,000 and climbing. James Mitchell's tech livestream was being shared by verified accounts across Silicon Valley. The hashtags Marcus Williams and Skyline Discrimination were trending on multiple platforms. News outlets picked up the story within minutes. CNN, ABC, NBC, all monitoring social media for breaking news, began covering the incident live. Financial networks started tracking Skyline Airways' stock price, which began declining as the story spread. But in the cabin of Flight 892, the story was just beginning. The cabin erupted into controlled chaos as the magnitude of what had just occurred began to sink in. Passengers throughout the aircraft were pulling out phones, calling friends, texting family members, posting updates across every social platform imaginable. The story of Marcus Williams wasn't just going viral. It was becoming a cultural moment in real time. Sofia Hernandez's Instagram live viewer count climbed past 100,000 as celebrities and influencers began sharing her stream. Comments flooded in faster than the app could display them, a digital river of outrage, support, and disbelief. "I can't believe what I'm witnessing," Sofia narrated for her audience, her phone steady despite her shaking hands. A black CEO was just removed from his seat on his own airline because the flight crew couldn't imagine that someone dressed casually could afford first class. This is 2024, and we're still dealing with this. James Mitchell's tech-focused live stream had attracted an even larger audience as news spread through Silicon Valley networks. Venture capitalists, startup founders, and technology journalists were sharing clips across LinkedIn and Twitter, turning Marcus Williams into a symbol of the casual racism that successful people of color faced even at the highest levels of achievement. For those just joining, James explained to his rapidly growing audience, Marcus Williams, CEO of Vanguard Technologies, and apparently the largest shareholder of Skyline Airways, has just revealed his identity after being discriminated against by his own employees. The irony is staggering, but the implications are massive. Dr. Patricia Hayes, who had initially judged Marcus herself before recognizing the injustice of his treatment, was now recording her own video message. "I'm a physician, and I've been traveling in first class for 15 years. I've never been asked to verify my ticket legitimacy. I've never had my boarding pass examined under a microscope. The difference between my experience and this man's experience is obvious, and it's unacceptable." David Patterson, the corporate lawyer, had abandoned his other work entirely and was documenting every development with the thoroughness of someone building a federal civil rights case. "What we've witnessed here is textbook institutional bias," he told the camera. "Employees who believe they're following procedures, but those procedures are applied selectively based on passenger demographics. This is exactly why civil rights laws exist. The hashtag evolution was rapid and organic." Skyline shame had started with Sofia's initial posts, but as the story developed, Marcus Williams began trending worldwide. When billionaires experience bias captured the unique irony of the situation. Own Your Own Airline became a celebration of Marcus's power to create immediate consequences. Celebrity responses started flooding social media within minutes. NBA players, musicians, actors, and political figures began sharing the story with their millions of followers. Oprah Winfrey retweeted James Mitchell's live stream with the comment, "This is why representation in ownership matters." LeBron James posted on Instagram, "Money doesn't protect you from racism. Power does." The financial markets responded immediately. Skyline Airways stock began dropping as automated trading algorithms detected the surge in negative social media sentiment. Financial news channels picked up the story with CNBC running a breaking news banner. Airline CEO discriminates against own passenger in viral incident. But the most powerful responses came from ordinary people sharing their own experiences. The comment sections filled with stories from travelers who had faced similar treatment, who had been questioned and doubted and made to feel unwelcome in spaces they had paid to occupy. A black surgeon from Atlanta posted, "This happened to me last month on a different airline. They examined my ticket 3 times and asked if I was sure I was in the right seat. Now I know I wasn't imagining the bias." A Latina tech executive shared, "I've been asked if I'm traveling on my company's dime more times than I can count, as if I couldn't possibly afford business class on my own salary." An Asian American venture capitalist wrote, "The assumption that success has a specific skin color is everywhere, even in industries that consider themselves progressive." The story resonated because it represented something universal. The experience of being judged by appearance, of having to prove belonging in spaces that others occupied without question. Marcus Williams had become a symbol not just of racism in aviation, but of the exhausting daily reality of performing respectability while your credentials were questioned. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Rachel Morrison stood frozen near the galley, her face pale with the realization that her career at Skyline Airways had just ended. Not only had she discriminated against a passenger, she had discriminated against the owner of the company, and she had done it in front of dozens of witnesses with recording devices. Captain Derek Sullivan was struggling to process the complete reversal of authority that had just occurred. 20 minutes ago, he had been the unquestioned commander of his aircraft, making decisions about passenger removal with confidence. Now he was facing suspension, potential termination, and public humiliation as videos of his discrimination spread across the internet. Maria Rodriguez finally stepped forward from the jetway, her conscience overriding her fear of retaliation. "Mr. Williams," she called out, her voice shaking but determined. "I'm Maria Rodriguez, gate agent for this flight. I want you to know that I've seen your name on passenger manifests before. I know you're a legitimate passenger, and I should have spoken up sooner." Marcus turned toward her with something that might have been relief. "Thank you, Maria. It takes courage to speak the truth when your job might be at risk." "I've seen this happen before," Maria continued, her voice growing stronger. "Not just with you, but with other passengers. Some crew members, they make assumptions, and those of us who know better, we stay quiet because we're afraid." Her admission opened the floodgates. A catering supervisor who had been preparing meal service spoke up. "I've seen questionable behavior from this crew before. Passengers treated differently based on their appearance. Management needs to know." A maintenance worker doing final safety checks added, "There's been talk among ground crew about certain flight attendants being more selective about which passengers they scrutinize. We thought it was just gossip." The circle of silence that had protected discriminatory behavior was cracking. Once one person found the courage to speak truth, others followed. The institutional protection that had allowed bias to flourish was dissolving in real time. Victoria Palmer's voice came through Marcus's phone speaker, again addressing the cabin. "To all passengers on Flight 892, I want to personally apologize for this incident. Skyline Airways does not tolerate discrimination in any form, and we will be conducting a thorough investigation into how our policies and training failed to prevent this situation. But the passengers weren't interested in corporate apologies. They wanted accountability." Sofia Hernandez addressed her phone camera. "An apology isn't enough. This isn't an isolated incident. This is a pattern of behavior that was exposed because the victim happened to own the airline. How many other passengers have been treated this way without having the power to fight back?" James Mitchell echoed her sentiment to his live stream audience. The real question is what changes when the cameras aren't rolling, when the passenger doesn't have billions of dollars and equity ownership, when there's no viral audience to hold companies accountable. The story was evolving beyond a simple case of individual discrimination into a broader conversation about corporate culture, training effectiveness, and the mechanisms that allow bias to persist even in companies with progressive policies. News outlets were already reaching out to civil rights organizations for comment. The NAACP released a statement calling for federal investigation into airline industry practices. The Department of Transportation began receiving calls from congressional offices demanding answers. Marcus Williams remained calm throughout the eruption of support and outrage swirling around him. This was exactly what he had anticipated when he chose to fly under his real name, dressed casually without the armor of expensive suits or security details. He had wanted to understand the real experience of his airline, and now he had documentation that would support comprehensive reforms. But first he had immediate decisions to make about the employees who had discriminated against him and the passengers who had witnessed their bias. The power to create consequences was finally in the right hands. The atmosphere in the cabin had transformed from tense confrontation to stunned silence as passengers and crew grappled with the complete reversal of power that had just occurred. Marcus Williams, who 20 minutes earlier had been treated as a potential fraud, now commanded the undivided attention of everyone present. Victoria Palmer's voice continued through the phone speaker, each word carrying the weight of corporate crisis management. Mr. Williams, I have our regional operations manager en route to your location. I've also initiated emergency protocols for bias incident investigation. What are your immediate directives? Marcus looked around the cabin, his gaze taking in the faces of passengers who had witnessed the discrimination, crew members who had participated in it, and ground staff who had remained silent despite knowing better. His response would set the tone not just for resolving this incident, but for defining how Skyline Airways would handle similar situations in the future. Victoria Marcus said clearly, his voice carrying throughout the cabin. I want every passenger on this flight rebooked on competitor airlines at our expense. I want full investigation files for Ms. Morrison and Captain Sullivan by end of business today. And I want a comprehensive review of complaint patterns across all Skyline crew members. Rachel Morrison's legs almost gave out beneath her. The reality was sinking in. She had not only lost her job, but her discriminatory behavior was about to be scrutinized by the highest levels of corporate management. 8 years of employment pension benefits, health insurance, all gone because she couldn't see past her unconscious bias. Mr. Williams? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I never meant. I thought I was protecting the airline. Marcus turned toward her with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that might have been pity. Ms. Morrison, you thought you were protecting the airline from people who look like me. That's not security. That's prejudice. Captain Sullivan stepped forward, his authority completely stripped away, trying to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his career. Sir, I was following standard procedures for crew concerns. Captain Marcus interrupted. There is no standard procedure that justifies removing a passenger based on clothing choices. You made a command decision without gathering facts. In aviation, that kind of judgment error can be fatal. James Mitchell continued narrating for his live stream audience, which had now exceeded 200,000 viewers, as news outlets began embedding his feed in their own coverage. We're watching Marcus Williams dismantle the power structure that discriminated against him. This isn't revenge. This is accountability. Sofia Hernandez addressed her Instagram audience, which included several verified celebrity accounts that were sharing her content in real time. This is what change looks like when someone with actual power decides to use it for justice instead of just profit. Dr. Patricia Hayes, who had found her own voice during the confrontation, spoke directly to Marcus. Sir, as someone who initially judged you myself, I want to say that what you're doing here is necessary. Too many of us see discrimination happening and convince ourselves it's not our problem. David Patterson looked up from his legal notes with professional admiration. Mr. Williams, you've just created one of the most well-documented civil rights cases in aviation history. The video evidence alone will change how airlines train their employees. But Marcus wasn't finished. He had one more card to play that would demonstrate the true scope of his power and the depth of his commitment to change. Victoria, he continued into his phone, cancel Flight 892. Ground the aircraft. Send these passengers home with vouchers for competitor airlines and apologies that acknowledge what they witnessed today. The announcement hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Passengers looked around at each other with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Marcus Williams wasn't just firing the employees who had discriminated against him. He was shutting down the entire operation to make a point about accountability. Furthermore, Marcus added, his voice gaining strength. I want a company-wide investigation into bias incidents over the past 5 years. I want to know how many passengers have been treated the way I was treated today, and I want those passengers contacted with personal apologies and compensation. Victoria Palmer's response was immediate and professional. Understood, sir. We'll begin that investigation immediately. Should we also implement additional bias training for all customer-facing employees? Not just training, Marcus replied. I want new policies, new accountability measures, and new consequences for employees who treat passengers as guilty until proven innocent, and I want regular audits to ensure compliance. The passengers around him were capturing every word, every decision, every moment of this unprecedented demonstration of corporate accountability. But Marcus wasn't performing for the cameras. He was methodically dismantling the structures that had allowed his discrimination to occur. Rachel Morrison finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Mr. Williams, I'm sorry. I truly didn't know who you were." Marcus looked at her with an expression that was stern but not cruel. "Ms. Morrison, that's exactly the problem. You shouldn't need to know who I am to treat me with respect. Every passenger deserves the same courtesy you would show someone you recognize as important." The power dynamic had completely reversed. The woman who had questioned Marcus's right to occupy first class was now begging for understanding from the man who owned the airline. The captain who had threatened to have Marcus removed was now facing termination from the passenger he had tried to eject. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Maria Rodriguez approached Marcus with visible determination despite her fear. "Mr. Williams," she said, her voice shaking but clear, "I need to tell you something. This isn't the first time I've seen discriminatory behavior from this crew. I've seen it with other passengers, people who didn't have your resources to fight back. I stayed quiet because I was afraid for my job, but I can't stay quiet anymore." Marcus nodded with something that might have been respect. "Maria, thank you for speaking up now. It takes courage to tell the truth when your livelihood is at stake. You'll be protected for coming forward." Her statement opened the floodgates for other employees who had witnessed problems but remained silent. A baggage handler stepped forward. "I've heard crew members making comments about passengers' appearances during pre-flight briefings." A gate supervisor added, "There have been complaints from passengers about treatment on Skyline flights, but they often get buried in paperwork." Each revelation demonstrated that Marcus's experience wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of institutional bias that had been protected by corporate structures and employee silence. The social media explosion continued to grow. Marcus Williams was now trending in 12 countries. News outlets were leading their broadcasts with the story. The clip of Rachel Morrison questioning Marcus's ticket legitimacy was being viewed millions of times across platforms. But the most powerful content was coming from Marcus himself. His calm responses, his methodical dismantling of the discrimination, his focus on solutions rather than revenge. He was demonstrating what leadership looked like when someone used their power to protect others rather than just themselves. Victoria Marcus said, preparing to end the call, "I want quarterly reports on passenger complaints, crew performance metrics, and bias incident tracking. I want this company to become an example of how aviation should treat all passengers." "Absolutely," Sir Victoria Palmer replied. "We'll implement these changes immediately." Marcus ended the call and looked around the cabin one final time. Passengers were still recording, still sharing, still processing what they had witnessed. He had achieved something remarkable, turning a moment of personal discrimination into a catalyst for change. But the real test would come in the months ahead when the cameras were off and the social media attention had moved on to other stories. The question was whether the reforms he had initiated would survive beyond this moment of crisis. For now, though, Marcus Williams had demonstrated that power, when wielded with purpose, could bend the arc of justice in real time. The aftermath of Marcus Williams's revelation unfolded with the swift precision of a corporate restructuring. Within 30 minutes of his phone call with Victoria Palmer, Skyline Airways employees at every level were receiving emergency communications about new protocols, immediate suspensions, and company-wide policy reviews. Rachel Morrison's badge was confiscated by airport security as she was escorted from the aircraft. The woman who had confidently questioned Marcus's right to sit in first class now walked through the jetway without speaking, her career in aviation effectively ended by her inability to see past her own prejudices. Her termination paperwork was already being processed, and her name would be flagged in industry databases, making it nearly impossible for her to find similar employment. But Marcus wasn't seeking revenge. As Rachel reached the gate area, she found an envelope waiting for her. A letter from Marcus recommending counseling resources and bias training programs that could help her understand what had happened and perhaps find a path toward redemption. It was an act of grace that surprised everyone, including Rachel herself. Captain Derek Sullivan faced even more severe consequences. His pilot's license was under federal review. His employment with Skyline Airways terminated immediately, and his 23-year aviation career effectively over. The FAA had opened an investigation into his decision-making process, and other airlines would be reluctant to hire a pilot who had shown such poor judgment in a high-profile incident. Unlike Rachel, Sullivan had not shown any recognition of his errors or willingness to learn from them. His termination letter included no recommendations for rehabilitation, no offers of support. Some consequences were about education and growth. Others were simply about accountability. The passengers who had witnessed the discrimination found themselves in various positions of empowerment and validation. Sofia Hernandez's Instagram following had grown by 50,000 in a single hour, and major media outlets were requesting interviews about her role in documenting the incident. She had gone from travel blogger to civil rights documentarian overnight. James Mitchell's livestream had become the definitive record of the incident, viewed more than 5 million times and cited by news organizations as primary source material. His tech industry audience had transformed the story into a broader conversation about workplace bias and corporate accountability. Dr. Patricia Hayes, who had initially judged Marcus herself before recognizing the injustice of his treatment, became an unexpected advocate for examining one's own unconscious prejudices. Her video statement acknowledging her initial bias had been shared extensively as an example of how people could recognize and correct their own discriminatory thinking. David Patterson, the corporate lawyer, found himself with enough documented evidence to file federal civil rights complaints that would strengthen protections for future passengers. His meticulous record-keeping during the incident provided legal precedent that would influence aviation industry practices for years to come. Most importantly, Maria Rodriguez's courage in speaking truth to power had been rewarded. Marcus personally called Victoria Palmer to recommend Maria for promotion to Passenger Advocacy Coordinator, a new position created specifically to handle bias complaints and ensure they received proper investigation rather than bureaucratic burial. The social media explosion showed no signs of slowing. Marcus Williams continued trending worldwide, but the conversation had evolved beyond the specific incident into broader discussions about corporate responsibility, bias training effectiveness, and the power of documentation in fighting discrimination. Musicians were releasing songs inspired by the incident. Artists were creating illustrations of Marcus sitting calmly in his seat while chaos erupted around him. Writers were analyzing the moment as a symbol of quiet strength triumphing over institutional prejudice. But perhaps the most significant immediate consequence was the message Marcus's actions sent to other business leaders. CEOs across industries were calling emergency meetings to review their own company's bias training programs, complaint procedures, and employee accountability measures. The stock market response was complex and revealing. Skyline Airways stock had initially dropped 12% as news of the incident spread, but it began recovering as investors recognized that Marcus's ownership stake and commitment to reform actually strengthened the company's long-term prospects. Airlines with poor diversity records saw their stocks decline as investors worried about their own potential exposure to similar incidents. Marcus himself remained focused on implementation rather than celebration. He spent the rest of the day in meetings with Skyline executives reviewing complaint data, examining training materials, and designing new accountability structures. He wasn't interested in being praised for handling discrimination well. He was determined to prevent others from experiencing what he had endured. The ripple effects extended far beyond Skyline Airways. Other airlines began reviewing their own policies preemptively. The Department of Transportation announced plans for industry-wide bias audits. Congressional representatives called for hearings on discrimination in aviation. But the most meaningful consequences were personal and immediate. Passengers who had previously suffered similar discrimination but felt powerless to fight it began coming forward with their own stories, empowered by seeing someone with resources use those resources to create change. A black surgeon from Memphis contacted Marcus directly. "I've been questioned about my first-class tickets 17 times in the past 3 years. I thought I was imagining the pattern until I saw your story." A Latina tech executive from Phoenix reached out. "Your calm response showed me how to handle these situations with dignity instead of anger. Thank you for demonstrating that strength doesn't require raising your voice." An Asian American venture capitalist from Seattle wrote, "Seeing someone with real power use it for justice instead of just profit gives me hope that change is possible." The incident became a case study in crisis management, not because of how Skyline Airways handled the situation, but because of how Marcus Williams had handled it. Business schools began incorporating the incident into their curricula as an example of how individual actions could create widespread change. Victoria Palmer Skyline's CEO found herself leading a company transformation that would define her own legacy. The policies Marcus demanded weren't just corporate public relations. They were fundamental changes to how the airline operated. Every employee would be retrained, every procedure would be reviewed, every complaint would be investigated by an independent oversight committee. The Human Resources Department was restructured entirely with new personnel brought in specifically to handle bias complaints and ensure they couldn't be buried in bureaucracy. Customer service training was redesigned from the ground up, focusing on treating every passenger with equal respect, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. The changes came with significant costs: training expenses, compensation for past victims of discrimination, and new oversight structures. But they also came with benefits. Employee morale improved as workers felt more confident about reporting problems. Customer satisfaction ratings increased as passengers experienced more consistent service. The company's reputation, initially damaged by the viral incident, began to recover as people saw evidence of genuine reform rather than empty promises. Marcus Williams had accomplished something remarkable. He had transformed a personal experience of discrimination into a catalyst for industry-wide change. The man who had been questioned about his right to occupy first class had used his actual ownership of the airline to ensure that no future passenger would face similar treatment. The immediate consequences were clear and decisive. The long-term impact would depend on whether the reform survived beyond the media attention and whether other companies learned from Skyline's example or waited for their own viral moments of accountability. 6 months after Flight 892 became a global symbol of corporate accountability and individual dignity, Marcus Williams sat in Seat 1A on a Skyline Airways flight to Tokyo. The same route, the same seat, but everything else had fundamentally changed. The flight attendant who greeted him was professional warm and treated him with exactly the same courtesy she showed every passenger, not because she recognized him as the airline's owner, but because that was now the standard for every traveler, regardless of their appearance or perceived status. The transformation hadn't been easy or instant. Real change required more than policy updates and training sessions. It demanded a complete cultural shift that touched every aspect of Skyline Airways operations. The Williams Protocol, as it became known throughout the aviation industry, established new standards for passenger interaction, complaint, investigation, and employee accountability. Flight attendants could no longer question passenger credentials without specific evidence of fraud. Complaints about discriminatory treatment triggered automatic independent investigations. Employee evaluations included diversity metrics and bias awareness assessments. But the most significant change was philosophical. Skyline Airways had shifted from a company that tried to prevent discrimination after it happened to one that actively worked to ensure it never occurred in the first place. Rachel Morrison had completed an intensive bias counseling program and was now working for a civil rights organization helping other companies understand how unconscious prejudice could destroy careers and damage lives. Her story became a cautionary tale, but also one of potential redemption for those willing to confront their own biases and work toward change. Captain Sullivan had left aviation entirely unable to accept responsibility for his role in the incident. Some people were willing to learn from their mistakes. Others were too proud to acknowledge they had made any. Maria Rodriguez had thrived in her new role as passenger advocacy coordinator, creating programs that empowered customers to report problems and ensuring those reports received serious investigation. Her courage in speaking truth to power had been rewarded with meaningful responsibility and the respect of colleagues who valued integrity over conformity. As Marcus's flight prepared for takeoff, a young black teenager in seat 2B caught his attention. The boy kept looking around nervously, clearly overwhelmed by his first experience in first class. First time, Marcus asked quietly. The teenager nodded. My mom saved up for 3 years to buy me this ticket for my graduation trip. I keep thinking someone's going to tell me I don't belong here. Marcus smiled, remembering his own first flights, the constant worry that someone would question his right to occupy premium seating. You belong anywhere, your ticket says you belong. And if anyone suggests otherwise, you tell them Marcus Williams said that's completely unacceptable. The boy's eyes widened with recognition. Are you really the guy who changed everything? I didn't change everything, Marcus replied, looking out the window as the aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky. I just helped people remember something they already knew. We don't transport passengers based on their clothes or their skin color. We carry human beings with dreams and destinations and dignity. Every single person deserves the same respect. The teenager settled back into his seat with visible relief, no longer worried about belonging. He pulled out a book about computer programming, and Marcus recognized something of himself in the young man's determination to learn and grow. What do you want to study? Marcus asked. Artificial intelligence, the boy replied enthusiastically. I want to build tools that help people instead of judging them. Marcus nodded approvingly. The next generation was already thinking about how to use technology to solve human problems rather than perpetuate human prejudices. That gave him hope for the future. The flight to Tokyo was smooth and uneventful, exactly what air travel should be for every passenger. Marcus completed his work, reviewed his presentation materials, and reflected on how much had changed since that day when Rachel Morrison had questioned his right to sit in the seat he now occupied without incident. The business deal he closed in Tokyo was successful, but it wasn't the most important outcome of his journey. The real victory was in the thousands of passengers who were now traveling with dignity intact, the employees who were working in an environment that valued equality, and the industry that had been forced to confront its own biases. Change hadn't been limited to Skyline Airways. Other airlines had implemented similar protocols, often citing the Marcus Williams incident as motivation for reform. The Department of Transportation had established new guidelines for bias training and complaint investigation. Congressional hearings had led to stronger federal protections for airline passengers. But the most meaningful change was personal and quiet. Marcus no longer traveled with the constant awareness that his presence might be questioned, that his credentials might be doubted, that his dignity might be challenged. He could simply be a passenger heading to his destination like everyone else. As the aircraft crossed the Pacific Ocean carrying dreams and ambitions toward Tokyo, Marcus Williams understood that his story had become bigger than his individual experience. It had become proof that one person with courage and power could bend the arc of justice toward fairness for everyone. The fight for equality wasn't over. It probably never would be. But progress was real. Change was possible, and dignity could triumph over prejudice when people decided that silence was no longer acceptable. Marcus closed his eyes and allowed himself a moment of quiet satisfaction. He had used his power not to seek revenge, but to create a world where the next person wouldn't have to endure what he had experienced. That was legacy worth building one flight at a time. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message of courage and justice. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories about people who refuse to accept discrimination and instead choose to create change. Drop a comment below telling us about a time when you witnessed or experienced unfair treatment. Your voice matters in this conversation. And remember, real progress happens when each of us decides to speak up instead of staying silent. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep standing up for what's right.